Okay.
This. Okay, this meeting is being recorded. You are consenting to being recorded. Continue. Okay.
Okay. Are we recording it? Probably.
It says recording.
Okay.
I've got up in the top left-hand corner. I've got a little thing saying recording. So
Me too.
I'm
Me too.
Ladies
and gentlemen, I present to you my guest. It's really an honor to have such a guest. For those who don't know me very well, my formal education is analytical philosophy. And before I started running columns on political philosophy and so forth, I was an analytical philosopher, a student of analytical philosophy. I did some things during my studies on problem, body and mind, but then I got bored with it. But although I got bored with analytical philosophy, one of my heroes of analytical philosophy has always been Dr. Graham Oppy, professor from Monash University from Australia. I probably pronounced it okay now. Welcome, dear professor, and thank you for accepting my invitation.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
You've always been a challenge for me because I consider myself a Catholic, and I always consider myself a philosophical theist. And you yourself are a self-proclaimed, if I may say, atheist, a naturalist. So tell me, Doctor, what's the difference between philosophical theism and philosophical naturalism? Are they the same thing, or are there any differences?
Okay, so atheism, I think, is just the denial of the existence of God or the denial of the existence of gods, depending how broadly you want to take it. I mean, in a particular context where you've got two people, they might just be disagreeing about whether, say, the Abrahamic God exists or not, but they might also disagree more broadly about whether there are any gods or there's any God. And my atheism says that there's no God and there are no gods. And that's just a negative claim. In itself, it doesn't amount to very much. I mean, of course, there's big disagreement about whether God exists or not, but you can't support the position, the claim that there aren't any gods unless you're committed to a lot of other stuff. And where the other commitments come in is with naturalism. So the way that I think about naturalism, roughly it says that the causal order is just the physical universe, the natural universe. And so that excludes any non-natural causal agents. So it excludes God and it excludes gods. I think it also excludes pantheism and panentheism as well. But a bit like theism, which is in many quarters is not just a descriptive term, but it's a positive evaluative term. There are many people who think of naturalism as a positive evaluative term, and so people use the word differently. Some people use it more inclusively, some people use it less inclusively. So you find somebody like Mark Johnston at Princeton, who claims to be a naturalist, but also has views that look a lot like some kind of panentheism. Right. So whereas the way that I'm thinking about naturalism, it will rule out those views as well. We'll rule out pantheism and panentheism. But it doesn't really matter how we use the word so long as we're clear in any given conversation how we're using them.
According to the definition of naturalism, you presuppose there cannot be any theists that are also naturalists.
So there are certainly theists. So a theist is somebody who believes that God exists or believes that there are gods. And on my view, if naturalism is true, then theism is false. So the way that I'm thinking about it, naturalists are atheists. But the way that other people think about this, at least some people, some naturalists are also theists. Right? But if you're going to if you're going to argue for atheism, you need something to back it up. And the worldview that I've got is a naturalistic worldview, and I will appeal to resources in my naturalistic worldview to back up the atheistic claims that I make. Oh, sorry, to back up my atheism, since the atheistic claim is just there are no gods.
One of the most important arguments for the existence of God, you would probably say that it isn't an argument, or that it isn't sound argument, or that it isn't a good argument, but an argument we can both use to explain the terms you use as an analytical philosopher when you talk about naturalism and atheism. Leibniz's argument. Can I read it out loud, and then you will comment
Sure.
on it? Okay. Anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists, therefore the universe has an explanation of its existence, therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. What are your problems with this argument?
Okay, so if you think about what a naturalist is going to say and what a theist is going to say, there are options on both sides. The options on both sides are going to be about the status of the initial cause, whatever it is, right? So the theist thinks the initial cause is God and God makes the universe. The naturalist thinks the initial cause is the first state of the universe. So it's the, call it the initial singularity or whatever. And we can think about what the status of God or the status of the initial singularity is. You might think that there's some sort of infinite regress here. So there isn't actually an initial state. There's just, states going back. That was an idea that Leibniz didn't like, but it is available. Some theists think that there's this sort of infinite regress involving God. And then at a certain point, God produces the natural world. A different thing you could think is that the initial thing is contingent. It didn't have to exist, it just does. I think that Richard Swinburne has a view something like that as a theist. And you can find plenty of naturalists who suppose that it's just unexplained contingency, that there's a universe. The view I like the best will be one that says that the initial thing's necessary. And so on Leibniz's view, the explanation of the existence of God is that God had to exist. God exists of necessity. The corresponding naturalist view is just going to be that the initial state, the initial singularity, exists of necessity. It had to exist, right? So there's a parity here. There's a range of positions available on each side. There's no reason to think that one side is going to be better off than the other, because whatever's the best answer, infinite regress, contingent, necessary, both sides can have it. So the way that I think about it, there's no advantage to either party in considerations about the status of the initial cause.
But isn't there a discrepancy of some sort between postulating a necessary being as an explanation of contingent world or contingent amount of things or and so forth, and describing an initial contingent thing as necessary without any further cause for describing it as such?
So it's not contingent on this view, though. It's necessary. Okay. It would be a contradiction to say that it's contingent and it's necessary. The question is, so what's the best theoretical position to take here about the initial thing? So just think about causal reality, right? There's an initial cause. what's its status, right? So you can think there isn't an initial one, right? Infinite regress, you can think it's just contingent, or you can think it's necessary. There's a separate question, what is there? Is in the causal order there a God that creates the universe, or is there just the universe? And it seems to me that the view that says there's just the universe and its initial state is necessary has a small advantage over the one that says there's the universe and there's God. God makes the universe and God's initial state is necessary, because you've got an extra thing that's not doing any explanatory work, right? The explanation is being done by the appeal to necessity, and you can make that appeal equally to God or to the initial state of the universe. Or so it seems to me.
But I would, for example, I would say that there is no good or sound reason to assume that any of the contingent causes is really necessary. That's exactly why you have to postulate a necessary being outside the chain of contingent causes to explain why the chain of contingent causes exists. That's why I asked you about of whether there is a certain. It's my intuition. I don't know how to articulate the argument about it, but my intuition is there's some sort of discrepancy between these two things, postulating a necessary being as an explanation of why the chain of contingent causes are, and just ad hoc postulating one of the contingent causes as necessary. Wouldn't you say, you would probably say that it isn't ad hoc, but what would be your reason?
So I think, go back to the way I framed it, you shouldn't think about the particulars of the case. Just think about causal reality. There is this system of causes and effects. And then there's a general question, right? There's got nothing to do with details or anything that you believe. What's the status of the first one, if there is one, right? There might be an infinite regress, but suppose there isn't.
Okay.
Right. So we think, well, there's a kind of interesting trade-off here. If you say that the first thing's necessary, then you're not going to be, that's where explanation's going to come to an end. If you say the first thing's contingent, that's where explanation's going to come to an end. But there's now something that you aren't explaining that you were if you thought it was necessary, namely why you got that particular contingent thing. Now, some people are happy with kind of initial contingency, some people are not. I'm not sure that there's any very obvious reason to go one way rather than the other, but I lean towards saying, okay, so it's necessary. So that's that. So far, we haven't thought about the details at all. This is just a kind of general kind of consideration. Now, when we think, okay, so what is there, right? And we look at, okay, so there's a universe of causes going back. What's going to be the most economical explanation here? Well, if we go for necessity, it'll be more economical to think the necessary thing is the first thing in the universe rather than to have some extra thing outside. If it's an extra thing outside, we've got more types of things, and we've got an extra thing, neither of which economy favors. Now, there's more to what makes for a good theory than economy. But in this case, the only thing so far that we've talked about is explaining why there's this set of causes. And so it will be better to stop with the initial thing in the universe rather than to go outside. If you're thinking about this from the point of view of comparing two theories, right, they've both got a theory of they've both got an explanation of the initial thing, namely it's necessary, but the theistic theory's got an extra thing that, as from the point of view of anything that we've talked about so far, isn't doing any explanatory work. Right, so there's a reason to favour the naturalist theory. Of course, when we start thinking about other things that you might explain with God versus how you're going to explain them on the naturalistic picture, it might turn out that the theistic story is better. The claim here is just that insofar as you're looking at this historical chain of causes and you're thinking about, so what explains why there is a historical chain of causes, you won't get any advantage by appealing to God as opposed to just appealing to the, appealing to the necessity of God as opposed to appealing to the necessity of the initial state of the universe, or the thing that exists there, the initial singularity, whatever it is.
But the initial singularity, to the point that it is a physical description, it contains no description of how it could be the explanation of the chain of the chain of the contingent causes. While the description of God contains this description, God is a transcendent mind that has the power to create the contingent world. This is a description of God, and the description of initial singularity does not contain this this description. So that is why I ask myself a question. Okay, how you mentioned the economy and the Occam's razor and so forth. When can the economy be the standard for thinking about which theory is better, and till when? This is the main question for me. That's why I spoke about the discrepancy before, because it seems to me that it hits the wall. The economy standard hits the wall, and when it hits the wall, you just have to go other ways to search for other standards about explaining the contingent world.
Okay, so I don't think that it ever hits the world. I think that when we're looking for explanation, we're always managing this trade-off between keeping our commitments minimal and explaining as much as possible. And I'm just applying that in this case, right? Everything has an explanation on either view. Everything explains the first thing in terms of necessity, but one view has an extra commitment, the other one doesn't. If you think about the initial singularity and you think that it exists of necessity, then that initial state is expanding, and you have an and there are, it depends a bit now whether you want to think about laws or powers or however exactly you want to think about it, but there's everything that you need there to explain everything that comes afterwards, right? So it's not like there's something that's missing from the explanation in that case that you have in the other case. It's true that there's a whole lot of other stuff packed into the other explanation if you think of God as having a mind and having a plan and exercising power and so on. But that's one kind of explanation. It's not the only kind of explanation, and it's not the only kind of explanation that can be complete. Like, pick any subsequent feature of the universe, which let's suppose that the causal evolution is chancy. It's indeterministic. So if we pick some subsequent feature, why is it as it is? Well, because the initial state was necessary, the laws were necessary, there was evolution, the evolution was indeterministic, and this was the outcome at a certain point. If you've got God in the picture and you ask, why did we get this outcome? Well, God made let's suppose God made the initial state, God made the laws, the evolution was chancy, we got this outcome, right? It doesn't seem like there's going to be any difference. Pick any feature of the universe, it doesn't feel, any causal feature, it doesn't feel like there's going to be any difference in the quality of the explanation, right? So that's the kind of idea.
I know this, but this is a puzzle for me. For example, I never understood this. Maybe you can explain to me. For example, initial singularity is a physical. There's a physical description of initial singularity. To call this initial singularity necessary is a philosophical addendum to it. It's not a physical necessity of initial singularity. Is not a physical description of it. It's a metaphysical, philosophical addendum to call it necessary. And this is when you add this metaphysical description to the physical description, you're already doing something that is beyond naturalism, and that is beyond the standard of Occam's razor. Yeah, it seems to me, this is intuitively, I haven't really thought a lot about it for past years, but it seems to me intuitively that it is cheating to call it to still call it naturalism if you add a metaphysical description to a physical description, and then you call it an alternative hypothesis to postulating a necessary being that is God, which already contains the description of a being that is able to create a contingent world.
Okay, so there's quite a bit in there. So let me just pick up a couple of the things you said. There will be people who call themselves naturalists who won't like my view. Okay, because there are some people who call themselves naturalists who want to insist that you shouldn't have any beliefs about what there is that aren't certified by science. And I concede that my view is metaphysical, right? But for all that, it's naturalistic, given the account of naturalism that we settled on at the beginning. Part of where it comes from is thinking about modality. So I have what I think is quite a parsimonious view about modality. I think that every possible world shares some history with the actual world, diverges from it only because chances play out differently. So on my view, there aren't many possibilities, right? There aren't many possible worlds. There aren't many possibilities. The only possibilities, I'm talking here metaphysical, ontological possibility, right? But it immediately falls out of that picture that the initial thing is necessary, right? Because, it does so long as you think that there's an initial state. Whatever exists in the initial state is necessary. So I'm putting together some philosophical theorizing, which it's metaphysical, right? That particular picture of modality is metaphysical. But if you accept that picture of modality and you don't go along with sort of contemporary ideas that suppose that somehow whatever you can conceive of is possible or something like that, ideas which I don't like, then it's just a consequence of other things I believe that the thing in the initial state, so call it just the universe, the initial universe, exists of necessity.
But to think in modality and in the context of actual and hypothetical worlds, the initial singularity is a part of the world, of the actual world, and it could be the part of hypothetical worlds. Isn't it so that it's in the very nature of thinking in the context of modality that you have to presuppose initial singularity as a part of the actual and hypothetical worlds, but you immediately think about them as being contingent and describing the initial singularity as being necessary creates or implies that you have to take it out of the modality thought experiment. Shouldn't you take the necessary being out of the modality thought experiment?
So I don't think so. I think that it's just a consequence of that way of thinking about modality, that the initial thing, anything that actually exists in the initial state, is going to be necessary. Of course, you can have this picture of modality and be a theist, and indeed many theists are. They think that, right, every world begins with God. Right. So there's this initial thing and it exists of necessity. And then the differences that you get, I mean, you can think about it this way. God makes different worlds, but only because it's kind of chancy what comes out. That would map exactly onto the picture that I had. And you're not going to make the criticism of that theistic picture that somehow or other the necessity is just this add-on to the modality, right? So you can't do it to the naturalist view that I was defending either, right? It's just, if you've got a different set of intuitions, if you think that God doesn't have to create, so there's a possible world where there's just God, no creation, then you're going to think that the universe is contingent, right? If you think that God has to create, and if you think that there's only kind of one initial setup that God could make because God has to make the best world, except that it's chancy, then it will turn out that even on the theist view, that initial state is necessary. It'll be dependent because it's, you know, it's caused by God, but it will still be necessary. So there is a theistic view. I mean, you mentioned Leibniz. Leibniz kind of runs into this question about whether God has any freedom at all, right? Because God has to make the best world. He thinks there is a best world. He thinks that God makes it. But then the modal status of the initial state of the universe for Leibniz is precisely the same as the one I'm giving it, namely that it's necessary, right? So even for some theists, this picture is going to be sort of partly correct. Of course, I've left God out of it because I don't think I need it.
How do you deal with this? Again, this is intuitively a problem I recognize. Maybe it's not a problem at all. Maybe it's a pseudo problem. We both are minds that are doing these thought experiments, and of course it's a fact of the world that minds make thought experiments. And of course, it does not follow from that God exists, that a transcendent mind exists, but it seems that it follows that it is at least a big problem to get rid of the mind when you think about thought experiments.
So
you get what I'm headed at.
So I'm not sure, because I haven't said anything yet about my views about let's say mindedness, my views about beliefs, desires, thoughts, intentions, and so on. So the view that I adopt there is just an identity theory. So I think of beliefs, desires, intentions, and so on as neural processes or neural states. And so, of course, I think they're real. When we disagree about some claim, our beliefs are different. You know, you believe that God exists, I believe that God doesn't. And that's just a matter of there being differences in our neural states and neural processes. So I'm not sure that there's any particular additional difficulty that mind is going to create for this discussion.
Okay, but isn't it so that we have to presuppose a certain transcendent status of a conversation, even if we agree that there's a physical substrata to it? Because if we don't agree on the somewhat transcendent status of a conversation, then how do you understand a dialogue, a search for truth, a thinking, if you don't give it a status of a somewhat transcendent entity, that it's on another level than physical substrata of it?
So I'm not sure. I think that conversations are physical exchanges between organisms that have a long evolutionary history, right? And I don't see that there's anything transcendent in that. I mean, of course, it's extremely complicated, and the idea that you could kind of spell out all of the details, that you could have a complete and accurate theory of mind and meaning and so on, seems very remote as a possibility to me. But the kind of general outline doesn't seem to require any special metaphysical status for us, the things we believe, the things we say, or anything like that.
But you would agree that this is changing the common sense language when you talk about thoughts, conversations, and so forth in the terms of physical organisms being in inertia relationships. This isn't something an everyday person would agree on. Even as we speak now, we don't speak in such terms. We speak as if we agree on the relevancy of the language we use. We agree on the this is my intuition again, that it has a transcendent and it has to have a transcendent status. We speak, we debate as if we were agents, and physical entities and physical organisms cannot be thought of as agents, isn't it? So how can we get rid of the agents and still make sense in and of our conversations?
But surely organisms are agents.
In which sense?
So organisms act on their normally acquired beliefs, desires, intentions. That's how they pursue their goals, right? I think that it may be true that there's that amongst the kind of big divisions, philosophical divisions between people, there's a divide between those people, and including lots of quite ordinary people, who assume that some kind of naturalism, physicalism is true, and that there's in a certain sense, the full story about us is one that's told in physical and chemical, biological, neurobiological, psychological, and so on terms. But these all just fit together to describe a single system of things. And then there are other people who think that there's kind of a much more complicated metaphysics, because perhaps, for example, there's this separate substance that's the mind, and there's some interaction between mind and body and stuff like that. But that's not, that even if that's an intuitive picture to some people, it's by no means universal. And the thing I wanted to say is that we can manage our conversations even if we have these very different pictures, so long as we know enough about what other people's pictures are like. And that's just a matter of talking to them and working out what they think. So you can translate between, you know, when you're talking about beliefs and desires and intentions and so on, you've got a certain view about them, and I've got a certain view about them. But we can both agree on what it is that we believe, what we mean, what we intend, and so on, even though we're wedded to very different metaphysical pictures of what's going on when we're doing those things.
Okay, would you say that, okay, if you have this gap between physical or physiological or biological descriptions of people and reducing the conversations, dialogues, thoughts to the physical descriptions, would you say that the fact that we can discuss, search for truth, debate, have a dialogue, would you say that these are brute facts, about the world, would you consider them as being brute facts about the world that cannot be fully explained at the end in the sense of this gap between descriptions I mentioned before? Or would you be prepared to say that there have been already a good um, um, reductive theories about it?
Okay, so if we're talking about something like the autonomy of the sciences and the social sciences and the humanities and so on, I don't believe in, for example, reduction in the sense that you could express all the truths that there are to be expressed in the language of fundamental physics, or the fundamental physics plus chemistry, or fundamental physics plus chemistry plus biology. I think that from a kind of metaphysical point of view, there are lots of different scales in which you can look at the universe, and what you see when you look from a particular scale, you can use certain sort of vocabulary to describe it that's independent, more or less, certainly not reducible to the vocabulary at lower scales. So
Dr. Oppy?